In this video, we're going to be talking about how to use a graphing utility to verify functions or inverses numerically. We're also going to talk a little bit about the inverse function of a graph, what it means for a function to be one-to-one, and how to use the horizontal line test to determine if our inverse is a function. So let's begin by talking about the graphing utility to verify our functions or inverses numerically. There are three easy steps. First, you're going to plug your f of x into the y1 spot, and you're going to plug your h of x into the y2 spot. Second, in the y3 spot, you're going to plug in your f of h of x, and in the y4 spot, you're going to plug in your h of f of x. And you do this using the vars, yvars, functions buttons and menus on your graphing calculator. And third, you're going to see if the y3 and the y4 tables match. And if they do, they're going to be inverses, and if they don't, then they're not going to be inverses. So we're going to go ahead and do a quick example just to make sure that you understand how exactly to use your calculator. So we're going to use the equation f of x equals 5 over x minus 2, and its inverse, hopefully, h of x equals 5 over x plus 2. So we're going to pull up our calculator, and we're going to plug those into our y equals. So into our y equals in the 1 spot, let's just scoot this over so we can see our equations. We're going to plug in 5 over x minus 2, and in the y2 spot, we're going to plug in our h of x, which is 5 over x plus 2. And then in the y spot, we're going to take our f of h of x. So we're putting the h into the f. So we're putting our y2 into the y1. And this is where we use our vars menu. So we're going to hit vars. Oops. It's not vars. Vars. Arrow over to yvars. Then hit function. And we want our f1, which is our y1. And then we're going to do it again. So I put a parenthesis there. And now I'm going to go back in there. Vars. Yvars function. And choose the y2, which is our h of x value, and put a parenthesis there. So I have now done my f of h of x. I'm going to do the same thing except in reverse for my y4. So vars, yvars function. I'm going to choose the y2, parentheses, then vars, yvars function. Then I'm going to choose the y1. And now I have that opposite, so the h of f of x. This is where we're going to pull up our table. So we're going to pull up our table, and we're not looking at y1 and y2. We're looking at y3 and y4. So we have some errors because there's x's and denominators here, which means that there's going to be a number that they do not exist for, that they don't work, because you can't have a 0 in the denominator, right? But other than that, look, if we look and see, we see 1 and 1, we see 3 and 3, 4 and 4, 5 and 5, and we notice that here these numbers all match up, and that's what we're looking for. So because they all match up, we can say, yes, they are inverses. So we'll just go ahead and say, yes, they are inverses. We were able to verify it. And that's how you verify using your graphing utility. So let's talk a little bit about inverse functions of graphs. The inverse function of a graph. Notice that our graph looks a little symmetrical. You take the f of x and it reflects across the line y equals x, which is our little red dashed line, to produce the inverse of f. So here, our f of x is the gray line, and our inverse of f is the solid black line. If two functions are symmetric across y equals x, then they are inverses. That's kind of important. So if they're symmetric across y equals x, then they are inverses. Let's talk a little bit more about what it means for a function to be 1-to-1. A function f is 1-to-1 when for a and b in its domain, f of a equals f of b. So that implies that a equals b. Now something important is that a function f has an inverse function, inverse of f, if and only if f is 1-to-1. So let's talk a little bit more about what that means. That kind of comes into our whole, what is the horizontal line test and how can we determine 1-to-1 relationships. Okay, so here we have a picture of a graph. So we're going to talk a little bit about the horizontal line test. Sometimes it's known as the HLT for short. It's the HLT for short. The horizontal line test works very similarly as the vertical line test. So for the vertical line test, remember we have a vertical line and we move it from left to right. And if it, as long as it only touches our graph one time, each time we move it, then it's going to be a function. For the horizontal line test, instead of having a vertical line, we're going to have a horizontal line. And the same thing applies. As long as it touches the function or the equation one time, then our inverse is 1-to-1. But if it touches it twice, then our inverse is not 1-to-1, or rather f is not 1-to-1, and that's going to make it so that it does not have an inverse. So for example, if we look at the line that we are given here, and we take this line and we move it vertically, we see that in each of the spots we move it, and it doesn't have to be for each, but in at least one, that it crosses 2 times. And that tells us that this is not 1-to-1. Okay, this is what tells us that our function f, so f is not, let's write that better, f is not 1-to-1. So it does not have an inverse function, because remember we talked about right here a function f has an inverse function, inverse of f, if and only if f is 1-to-1. So because here it is not 1-to-1, that means that there is no inverse function for it. So that's how we use our horizontal line test.